So on the DASH, scores range from 0 to 100, like I said before, with higher scores indicating higher levels of disability. Clinicians do not require any training to perform the questionnaire, and it is free of charge on the website. The MCD and MCID DASH scores generally are between 10 to 12 points for most studies out of 100. However, a little bit later in the discussion, I'll talk about some of the differences that they found with among the MCID and MCD scores depending on the variables that you have in your study or your patient population. But as long as a patient sees from test to retest a 10 to 12 difference in their numbers out of 100 that's decreasing, that means there's been meaningful change for that patient, whether it's intervention, treatment, rehabilitation, whatever. In my scenario with my patient, I took her DASH score in March, and she was at a 27 out of 100. And then we took it again 2 weeks later, and she was 12 out of 100. So even with her, once we got through the hard part after the surgery where she couldn't really move around and do stuff for herself, once she was through that part, she was still struggling with some of those red flags that we talked about earlier, but you could see that there was starting to be meaningful change in her treatment. And after we had gone through and talked to her coach and talked to her athletic trainer and made some changes in some of the things that she was doing out at practice and ways that I could get her involved in the classroom, we started to see some improvements in her ability to function better and have less disability or dysfunction. So the DASH is an acceptable questionnaire for adults 18 to 64 years of age. It can be accomplished within 5 to 30 minutes. It can be used in younger populations. However, the DASH does have one question that may be inappropriate for the younger population, and it deals with difficulty with sexual activity. But the cool thing with the DASH is that you're able to either on purpose or from error omit at least 3 questions off of it and still get accurate scores. So even if a clinician chooses to omit that question, you can still calculate the scores electronically or by hand. The instrument appears to assess all levels of the ICF disablement model. However, like most PROs at this time, there are still weaknesses assessing the physically active person. The really neat thing that I found about this DASH was that it is in 50 different languages. And for my institution, we have a high number of international athletes. So I think that it would be really successful there because we would be able to give an outcome assessment that doesn't have that language barrier. So we could provide an assessment to different languages so that people were more likely to respond to the assessment and to not omit questions because they don't understand what's going on. So I thought that was pretty neat. The scores interpreted for clinicians is minimal, really under 5 minutes. And if you choose to use the electronic version, it calculates in seconds as soon as the person is done completing it. So I think the interpretability is pretty good. It's easy to use and it's friendly and likable. And so I think this is a good one to use. So when we're looking at measuring change in patients, I've been talking about the MCD and the MCID scores and how they relate and what those numbers mean. And so I looked at a couple studies and found some interesting facts. Okay, so I can't memorize this. So the first study I looked at had 55 patients with a variety of upper limb musculoskeletal disorders. They were assessed using both distribution and anchor-based measures to determine the MDIC for the DASH. The results indicated that the SEM was 4.63 and the MDC 90 corresponded to 10.81 points and the MCID of 10.83 points. So it kind of goes along with what I was saying earlier about the MCID score being between 10 and 12 for the DASH. So every study is going to be a little bit different, but within those numbers, the variables should show meaningful change. This responsiveness indicates calculated with distribution-based methods shows very similar values than those reported in the literature. So some of the stuff that I found through the literature was that the MDC scores ranged from 6.5 to 14.5. And in the DASH manual, the ranges were from 7.9 to 17.2. And when I looked at the Dash developer research, it showed that the score was 11 points, which is very close to the 10.81 that's found in this study of 255 patients. So it's showing that there is meaningful change within those numbers. The MCID score of 10.83 was inside the 95% CI for the ROC cutoff value. It was slightly higher than the MDC score, which is what we want to see, but many researchers have suggested that it would be better to determine a range of MCID values rather than a fixed number. So right now we're using a 10 to 12 number. More closer to 10 than 12, and they prefer that each individual research has its own number so that we can get the most accurate, meaningful change. Okay, another study that I looked at was Colbert. This was a systemic review. It had 18 articles, which was conducted to understand the properties of the MCID and the MCID of the DASH and the quick DASH. This review included both operative and non-operative shoulder injuries. Two studies by Schmid and DeFabio reported that the SEM of 5.22 and the MDC of 12.2, while another study by Gable reported the SEM of 2.84 and the MDC at 6.63. So I know that's a lot of numbers, but really what that's showing is that there is some variation depending on the study, depending on the variables of the study, and so it's going to be a little bit different. But as long as you're within that range, you should be showing meaningful change. The last part of the presentation is on implementation strategies. So a little bit about my institution. We're probably one of the smallest Division II colleges in the United States, but athletically, we're one of the largest institutions in Division II. So we have 25 varsity sports and 6 JVs, a competitive cheerleading and dance team, and we really have about 850 plus student athletes every year. So we've got a large population of student athletes coming through our school, and we have 7 full-time athletic trainers to really help try to facilitate that. So I've really been thinking about what we could do here to improve and to develop some strategies to get some PROs into our facilities. And I guess the first thing I want to talk about is just the barriers. For my institution, it's time. And that's no different than anything we've been reading through the literature. But my athletic trainers complain that they don't have time. They do too many treatments. They hardly have enough time to do their documentation. And so time is something that's really impeding the ability to implement some of these strategies. So some of the things that I've been thinking about, we implemented electronic documentation this year. And so before then, everything was on paper. And so I got to see all 7 athletic trainers and really how they transitioned through this electronic process. And it was pretty funny to see some of them. Some of them transitioned really easily. Some of them are still fighting the system. And some had a hard time but have finally picked it up now. So what I was thinking is, since I was able to witness that, what if I just used the athletic trainers that did really well with the electronic documentation? They picked it up, they accepted it, they moved on, they knew it was just part of what they were doing. What if I just use a few of them? So next fall, if I want to implement some of these PROs, why don't I just use those few folks that could help me, because they accept change and are easy to accept things and move on from them. So if we get together and talk about doing some paper forms of some PROs, I'd like to implement one upper body, one lower body, one general, and I'd also like to implement the GRC, because we can do that every time somebody comes in to assess them. Okay, so what I was thinking is the LEFS, the DASH, the DPT, and the HIT6, because I want my population to be post-surgical and also concussion, because we have got a lot of concussion at our school. So I'd like to follow headaches and just those other 3 assessments with the GRC. I feel like with that, we could start very easily, see how it works just with some post-surgical patients, and move on from there. Eventually, we should transition and streamline into electronic software system where it's easier for the athlete to be able to update and get messages and to be informed that it's time to do it, and there'll be less time out of their treatment time where they're filling out forms and going over this stuff. And athletic trainers will eventually get more used to that system and will adapt to it easily. Other ways that I feel like as a group that we could improve, for the athletic trainers that are already certified and practicing, I think implementing things that are free will really help people go and watch them, listen to them, and learn from them. So implementing free CEUs, implementing free seminars, free conferences, flooding the area with some of these PROs, and really educating on how they can help the patient. For our athletic training students that are not certified yet, we could talk about maybe implementing a new standard into the CATI for as part of their clinical proficiencies and part of their competencies that they need to complete before they graduate, so that these just become secondhand to some of our students and it becomes more accepting into the workforce. And those are some of the things that I would like to see at my institution. Thanks for listening.